But Labor caucus members are starting to show their cards ahead of Monday's leadership ballot, and Michael Danby is the Labor member for Melbourne Ports, and he joins us in the studio. Some of your comments earlier this week helped to precipitate the position that we find ourselves in now, because you said that Kevin Rudd had in fact been briefing journalists. You confirmed that. Where do things stand at the moment?
Well, Kevin's not a Joan of Arc character. I know he made those two sort of rather martyrish press conferences in Washington, but look, the people of Australia, the government had to bring this to a conclusion, and if I played some small role in doing that, you've actually made my day.
What do you think of the way he's conducted himself over the last couple of days?
Well, look, we're all consenting adults here. I mean, he is a person who's been undermining the government, been backgrounding journalists, and having his so-called independent Labor strategists like Bruce Hawker, who's in fact a lobbyist for him, it now emerges, lead a campaign to undermine the government. Look, the Australian people don't want to discuss internal Labor Party politics. I'm convinced the cone of silence will come back down on us, on our internals on Monday.
You sure about that?
Well, you know, as far as I'm concerned, once the vote is over, it's over. I know the Prime Minister's asked Kevin, please don't pursue this any further. He wants to do a two-stage strategy like Mr Keating, but to quote that great American Senator Lloyd Benson about Dan Quayle, we all know Paul Keating, and he's no Paul Keating.
But he's going to keep potentially, of course, sniping at the Prime Minister from the backbench, should he indeed run and should he lose on Monday.
Well, I think that is a very perceptive comment, and that is what's going to, I think, influence a lot of people in the Labor Parliamentary Party to decide not to support him, because they don't want this to continue to go on. This is not a soap opera. This is the government of Australia.
If Kevin Rudd was as dysfunctional as Julia Gillard's supporters have labelled him over the last few days, why was he left on the front bench?
Let's break into this conversation now, Karina, because we can now bring you the comments by Kevin Rudd.
The Prime Ministership. So just for some reaction to this, let's go to Michael Danby, who's the Labor member for Melbourne Ports, and Julia Gillard, a supporter. What did you make of what Kevin Rudd just had to say? Well,
it's a sad inversion of reality. I mean, we have had the Foreign Minister undermining the Prime Minister in the government. The tragedy of Kevin Rudd is that he's a very capable man, as you can see from that press conference, and there were many good things done during his government. In fact, on matters of foreign policy, I think he is a person who I agree with completely on particularly the most important issue of Australian foreign policy, his ultra-realistic views about China. But to talk about faceless men when he's got his guys out, Bruce Hawker out, the lobbyist or independent strategist, we're not quite sure what his role is. He's got other people working behind the scenes getting the numbers. I mean, he's not Joan of Arc, he's a mortal politician like the rest of us. And I hope the Australian people, when they're ringing offices and using these Tea Party tactics that he's trying to do to sort of get MPs to be emailed from all over the country into one office, that people have a more realistic view of what he's
He also,
doing.
as you heard, picked up on suggestions that some Labor MPs were being threatened with being stripped of their pre-selection, and he called on the Prime Minister to guarantee no pre-selections will be taken away. Has that been going on?
I've never heard of that, and in fact, a lot of us who are on opposing camps, I think of one particular friend here in Victoria, have been saying to each other, we've got to be friends after all of this too, because there are these differences of opinion over issues, and I wouldn't be any part of that, and I don't think that's been going on. Sometimes you raise these straw men in order to make yourself look better, and I think again this is an example of it.
He also raised what he called some details from what he called the midnight coup, and that Julia Gillard had in fact, or they'd made an agreement that he was to be given more time to change, and then 10 minutes later Julia Gillard walked back into the room and said that all bets were off. All of these details now coming out, it surely doesn't help to paint the Prime Minister in a good light.
Well, these kind of allegations were made before. Look, all I can say to you is I remember the mood back then. The government was was paralysed. His senior advisor, Alastair Walton, had come into my office and said that the government was down on 32%, and that we couldn't have an election because our primary vote was so depressed. I remember more than 100 caucus members were going to vote against him. That's why we didn't have a ballot, because it would have been humiliating for Kevin. So, I mean, you can invert history, but there were those of us who were there.
Just before we go, Michael Danby, you say we'll all be friends on Monday, but any sane person watching what has happened over the last 48 hours and watching that media conference and your reaction to it would say that's impossible. You're accusing him of using Tea Party tactics, Kevin Rudd accusing others of trying to tear him down and, adopting
Tea Party tactics are using,
but it's been
people
nasty,
outside the parliament.
It's been nasty, vitriolic stuff on both sides of the fence, as you well know. How can Labor possibly pick itself up from this?
Well, I thought Bill Shorten had a good attitude. Stephen Smith had a good attitude to it on the various programs that they've been on. And you've noticed that I haven't been vitriolic about him. I'm politically opposed to what he's doing, but I recognise his qualities too.
Michael Danby, thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
And let's bring